what life advice for success would you give an 18-year-old in the world? And they specifically are asking, would you recommend them going to the university? Which I know you tweeted about, but something interesting to talk about.
The universities are complicated. I mean, right now you sort of probably want to go to them because they're these very strong curators, and so they have a signal. They give you a badge that unfortunately is still very useful in large parts of society. But I joke that university degrees are the new taxi medallions in that they're artificially scarce and they're required for certain things, but they're going to be obsoleted relatively soon or already are in many disciplines. So you can already see some substitutes emerging for the university degree. For example, if you start a company that VCs fund, or if you join Y Combinator, that can be a substitute for a university degree. If you win some incredible medal or award, or you launch a company or build a website or do something interesting when you're very young, that can be used as a credential, or you write some great book or what have you, that can be used as a substitute. But it's a rare person right now who can really skip the university. They would have to be very autodidactic, especially in the technical domains. So I don't think it's kind of doable for everyone. It is a unique small set, like the so-called Teal Fellows, for example, or people who are chosen for that, and there just can't be that many of them yet. That said, I think it'll get easier because the credentialing will become less important out of a university. The other thing is, I think there's a whole class of university degrees that are pretty worthless. If you're not getting a STEM degree or a degree that can help you build or fix things, then you don't need a degree for it. You can just read books on it. I mean, that's you can teach yourself. So really, the classical university degree where you're investing 4 years of your life, and boy, isn't it a coincidence? It takes 4 years to learn anything, regardless of whether it's English lit or physics. I would argue that if you can learn it on your own, then you don't need a university degree for it. To the extent you need it for signaling, there's a fun little hack, which is, at least in Silicon Valley or the greater tech ecosystem, it's almost better to get accepted to Stanford and then drop out than to actually finish the degree. First, you're in a very illustrious cohort of people who then went on to be very successful, or at least that's the perception, which is good enough for signaling purposes. And secondly, you just save yourself a lot of time. You've shown you've passed the filter, but then you recover the next 3 years. Now, I think a lot of the Stanford students who are ambitious also get around this by starting companies while they're at Stanford. But they used something like Stanford, you could say, one third curation slash signaling, which is done the moment you get in, and then one third sort of alumni network and networking with other smart people that you may want to start a company or do something with, and then maybe there's a third of it that's actually the education.
So moving
I would I
to,
would I would I would say, if you're, sorry to interrupt. I
no,
would
go
say
ahead.
if you're the kind of person that needs to question whether or not you should go to university, at least today in 2021, yes, then go to the university. On the other hand, there are a small set of people who can't stand the idea of wasting 3 or 4 years of their life in a university when they could be doing something, and those people should not go to universities. But you will know. It is one of those things where if you are going to err on the side of going to a university. Now, I would say go to the best university you possibly can, because the signal slash curation function is the most important. And then secondly, once you're in, study something worthwhile that you absolutely cannot learn on your own, whether it's biology or law or medicine or my favorites are physics, math, computer science, the hard skills. Because once you're good at mathematics, then you don't fear any book. Then you can learn anything on your own later. But I would say the soft, squishy skills, those are the ones where I think it would be suspect. Like if you're going to go to a middling school and graduate with like a social sciences degree, I don't know if you're going to pay back your student loans.
So on the other end, people who perhaps going to university isn't really even an option for them. There's a question about if with leverage that we're seeing with like technology, and you've talked extensively about self learning for coding and other ways to essentially create financial freedom on the internet. There's a few questions asking if you believe or if you think that the trend towards moving to English speaking countries are important, and your kind of your thoughts on that. That question was asked a few times in a few different ways.
Yeah, English is the lingua franca of the internet, ironically enough. And so the internet took English from being a plurality of speakers to, I think it's going to take it to a majority of online speakers. And because a lot of technical stuff is written in English, various websites work best in English, apps work best in English. If you want to be a first-class citizen on the internet, it really helps to be fluent with English. The reason I'm up here and not in the audience like the rest of you is because I happen to be more articulate than the average person with English, because I read a lot of books when I was a kid. And so I just happen to be good at expressing myself in the English language, and that's a big deal. That eloquence turns someone into a speaker as opposed to a listener. So there's huge value in being a good native English speaker. So I think places like India are advantaged by the trend towards remote work and Zoom and Clubhouse and so on, because it gives more of them an opportunity to compete on a relatively level playing field. One of the things that people are going to learn with remote work is not really about letting the Facebook engineer work from Ohio instead of from Silicon Valley. I mean, that may be true in the short term, but in the long term, it's really about, Amit from India being able to work for Facebook in Silicon Valley, but while he's in, some rural town in India. So, that's going to disrupt and change lives in global supply chains. Some people will be better off, some will be worse off, but that's true globalization happening. So, yeah, English is a superpower. If I had to pick subjects for my kids to learn, I'd really, really drill down on logic, math, computer science, and English. And then I think everything else they can follow their natural intellectual curiosity. So if they want to learn music, they can learn music, but you don't like force them to go learn the violin just because you have some idea that every kid should be a musician. The rest of it they can follow their natural aptitude, but English is foundational. It's the classic reading, writing, arithmetic, right? The classic stuff. To that I would add code and science, which are like slight variations on those, science being, call it language of, applied mathematics into nature, uh, and computers being applied mathematics into machines. But I think those are very foundational skills. Everything else you can kind of learn on your own.
So another question kind of along the lines of thinking about children, there's some parents on Twitter who wanted to ask, what are your thoughts or general perhaps advice for them on how they can pick for themselves if they want to homeschool their kids, if they should take their kids to private school, and regardless, like what type of social skills do you think they should be focused on helping their kids develop? And also, you actually already answered it, but they wanted to know what you would like to educate your kids on. So I think that the missing aspect here is social development with like homeschool or private school.
Yeah, I reject this whole social development thing. I know it's gotten very popular, but I think humans are social machines, and these days we're over socialized, not under socialized. We have Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, Clubhouse, Twitter, Facebook. We have unlimited ways to socialize virtually. Lots of kids I see are socializing in real life. If they're not socializing virtually, I would argue that socialization creates far more problems than it solves, and that the modern individual is over socialized. Exceptional people are built in solitude. That's not popular to hear, but it's true. It's the alone time that you spent when you were a kid that made you good at whatever you are. It wasn't the group time. The group time was spent having too much fun. Most likely, there are a few exceptions, but not many. Um, so I would say in general, socialization is actually the problem that you're trying to avoid, as opposed to the asset that you're trying to bring into it. And I think it's kind of pathetic how quickly we fall into saying, well, schools for socialization, and gee, what about socialization? We've abdicated on this idea that it's the best way to educate your child, because clearly it's not true. It's a combination of one size fits all education, compliance training, daycare, and and I would argue socialization, and the worst kinds of socialization in false little Lord of the Flies type worlds where people are very hierarchical. Who's the prom queen? Who's the football player? Who's the jock? Who's popular? Who's cool? Who's doing drugs? Who's not? All that stuff is nonsense. I mean, the further you get in life, the more of an adult you become, the more you get away from that. And we all remember that shock when we shifted from school to the real world. What a tremendous difference it was. And we'd just been in a little bubble for in our lives up until that point. So I would argue, and I don't care about, sure, people may ask me for citations, but there is plenty of evidence that homeschool kids do a lot better than even private school kids or public school kids. There's even evidence that unschooled kids who were basically just left alone with no education, tend to be at worst one grade behind uh, schooled kids. And then when they get to college, they actually catch up completely because they're interested. Think about that. All the time you spent in school, K through 12, really amounted to being 1 year ahead of a kid who didn't go to school at all. And then in college, that kid caught up right away because now they were genuinely interested. So I think the way we do schooling is much more about daycare And it's also preparing kids for the wrong things. I mean, 8 hours a day, 9 hours a day in a little group prison camp where you're sort of you have to raise your hand to go to the bathroom and they tell you how to think and how to behave. I mean, that this is it's terrible, but I think most parents don't have a choice, right? Most parents are busy working. We don't live in tribal societies anymore where grandma and the aunts and uncles can all raise the kids together. So raising kids is really hard. So we abdicate that to the state. The state turns into a lowest common denominator situation, and the kid ends up bored and compliant, and or having, most of their curiosity stamped out of them and just wasting an enormous amount of time. Most of the time spent in school is just completely wasted, and then they use it to build a social life because there's nothing else to do. So I just cannot imagine sending my kids to a regular school. Maybe I'll abdicate, maybe I'll be forced to. So I reserve the right to change my mind, but at least right now I don't think it's the best way to educate them. Obviously, I have the means and I have the time to do otherwise. If you don't have the means and the time, then send your kids to the best school possible, or try to form a local homeschooling group where you can share the burden, or try to live close to your tribe so you can you know do what you can there. That said, look, I am a product of mostly public schools, including, thank God, magnet schools, which I know are out of fashion now. But so I don't necessarily say that that won't work, but I do get the sense that at least in my time, public schools used to care a lot more about proper education and merit, and much less about being politically correct. So I'm not sure where schools are today, but I hope not to find out.